What is going on, everybody? Kyle Murray from FTNDaily.com bringing you the very first segment of our NFL Optimizer tutorial series where I'm going to be breaking down 7 different videos on ways that you can use the Optimizer, different settings, different features, ways I use it, different kinds of contests that you can use to enter in this, and the best ways to use the Optimizer in general. This first video is going to be basically just an overlying introduction, basically Optimizer 101 on the kind of things that you can do with this optimizer, some of the basics, and as we go on into further videos, I'll get a little bit deeper into specific topics and areas rather than this video where we're going to kind of just be doing a general overview. So right now we're going to be starting off with just the NFL videos, and then we'll venture on into some MLB videos, some PGA, and then some NBA when that season rolls around as well. So by the end of things, we will have tutorial videos for all sorts of sports, and as we keep going, we're going to continue to have content around this optimizer, so you will continue to see us using the optimizer live on shows and whatnot. So if you guys are watching this video the day it releases, which should be Friday, August 20th, the optimizer is currently free, so go on, check that out for all 3 sports, NFL, PGA, and MLB. It's free until Monday the 23rd, so make sure you guys are taking advantage of that while you still can. So without further ado, let's hop right into this video talking about the NFL Optimizer. And this is the first screen that you're going to see when you select NFL Optimizer on the FTNDaily.com website. So the first choice you get to make is the mode, main versus backtest. We're going to talk about backtesting in a future video, go a little bit more in depth into that, but basically you can go back, look at different sites from the past, kind of review them, not only review how players did, potential optimal lineups, you can kind of test and play around with some settings, some features in order to kind of get a feel for the product and kind of get a feel for how you can get the kind of lineups that you want. So again, we're going to talk about that in a future video, but for now, touching on the main slates, the main mode that is. So obviously you're going to pick the mode, and then you're going to pick the site, DraftKings or FanDuel. Then you're going to go ahead and decide the sport. You won't actually decide the sport here. You'll decide the sport up here at the Opto tab on the site. So once you click on that, you actually won't have to worry about deciding the sport. But then game type. So classic is going to be the standard, main slate type slates. Tiers, as you guys know, tiers, and then showdown. So we're gonna do this video in classic, and we're gonna talk about the main slate for week 1, which I've actually uploaded some, very first run rough draft type projections for the week 1 of the NFL season. So keep that in mind. These are gonna change a lot, but it's cool to have those in there and kind of see what the numbers look like within the model. So right here, you can see the game screen where all the games are. There's some good information here. You can see Vegas totals, spreads, times that the game starts, and obviously the matchups. So it's good to have there, but you can also filter players in or out based on just clicking the logo. If the purple outline is gone, that means they're going to be actually taken out of the player pool. So if you wanted to just maybe view 1 or 2 teams, you can do that by maybe unclicking all the games and then selecting which teams you wanted to look at. Or maybe there's a team that you just don't have any interest in playing. You can just click off of them and you'll get no exposure to them because they'll be removed from the player pool. So that is the game screen. You can filter it, you can hide it. Typically I like to actually keep it up because, again, it does provide some good information in terms of Vegas data and totals and stuff like that. So you can hide it to save some space, but it also has some good data there. All right, so moving on into the 4 features or tools that we have here. It's the correlation stacking, the legacy stacking, the player limits, and the player combinations. So these first 2 options here are different ways that you can stack. So the correlation stacking is basically going to be a universal stack. It's less specific, but it's more in general, so that way it can apply to each and every lineup. So here you're applying a universal rule to say I want at least the quarterback with at least one of a wide receiver or tight end from the same team. Now you can add secondary stacks and then maybe get a little bit more specific as you go, which is a good way to do this, but you can add secondary stacks by applying these numbers here, 1 or 2 secondary stacks, and then you can decide what kind of options or what kind of features you want within that secondary stack, which kinds of scenarios. So running back and defense on the same team, that's a popular correlation. You can say pass catcher from one team, and then you can add a pass catcher from the same team. So you're having 2 pass catchers from the same team, or you can do wide receiver plus an opposing team's pass catcher. So good ways to kind of get some additional correlation there in a secondary stack. But you can cancel that out and just stick with the universal rule, which is cool because it'll apply to each lineup no matter what. and we'll get into why that's cool when we look at the legacy stacking system. Say you're building lineups Sunday morning, maybe you don't have all week to build out these lineups, build out all these rules. You can apply this universal rule right here, and you'll get instant correlation by ensuring that all of your lineups will have a quarterback paired with at least one pass catcher. So once you close out of that, you can go and maybe you want to go throughout the week, add which stacks you want. You want to be more specific. You can do this here. So you say you wanted to say Patrick Mahomes, pair him with no less than one. So automatically we want one pass catcher. And then you can either decide on stacking Mahomes with a position, or you can stack him with a specific player. So in this case, let's say we want to stack him with a wide receiver and a tight end, at least one from the same team, no matter what. You can do that, quick and simple there, and obviously you can go and add each quarterback that you would want in your lineups, or each stack that you would want in your lineups. But you can also do specific players. So as we go, you can realize that sometimes you'll have quarterbacks that you want to include 3 or 4 different players within those potential stacking options. But other times, let's say a good example last year was the Ravens. Typically, you're only wanting to stack Lamar Jackson with maybe one of Mark Andrews or Marquise Brown. But maybe for someone like Mahomes, you want no less than one of, Mecole Hardman, Tyreek Hill, Travis Kelce, maybe even including the running backs in there. Obviously, last year you had Sammy Watkins. So with those kinds of quarterbacks, you can include all these options here. So you can type these names in here and get a feel for the kinds of options that you want within that stack. You can go through, add these, and you can do each quarterback, each pairing, each stack. So another example, we can go Josh Allen. So we want no less than, let's say, one player with Stephon Diggs will be included there. Gabriel Davis, Cole Beasley, and maybe we even want to include a pass-catching running back, Devin Singletary. Add that rule. So there you go. Now you have 2 stacking rules with the 2 quarterbacks that you selected. Now in the universal rule, you won't need to go through each quarterback and select them. They'll automatically do it. But with this particular option, you can be a little bit more specific, a little bit more customized by deciding which quarterback and which receivers or which pass catchers you want included in those options of stacking with that quarterback. So a couple of cool different ways. It's kind of 2 sides of the sword, right? You have a more general, more universal stacking feature, but you also have a more descriptive and more specific stacking feature. So you can kind of get the best of both worlds here. So then you can head on over to the per team player limits. This one's fairly self-explanatory. You can say at most I want 2 players from Houston. Or maybe you can say I want at least 2 players from Buffalo. Maybe Buffalo's going to be a team with a high team total that week, and you know that you want some Buffalo exposure. You can say you want at least 2. Maybe, I don't know, maybe the Colts have a really tough matchup. You can say you want no more, you want at most 1 player from the Colts. So a cool way to not only say you want to cap certain teams, but you can also say I want a minimum exposure to some teams right there. Then we have the player combination rules. This one is the way I think I'm going to use this one the most is more like correlation outside of quarterback stacks. So the way I thought of it was, say we have a game, say Seattle and Carolina are going to be in a high scoring game, right? Maybe they have like a 56 game total, right? Maybe we want to ensure that we're going to have the main fantasy producers in that game. So we're going to say we want to stack between 2 and 4 of McCaffrey, DJ Moore, DK Metcalf, and Tyler Lockett. And we want that in a minimum of, let's say, 20 lineups. Now you can also select all lineups, but it's cool to be able to say I wanted them in a minimum of 20 lineups. To ensure that maybe you get a little bit more diversification, you don't necessarily need to go all in on this particular stack. So heading on down into the optimization settings. So these settings and these features are more correlation and stack settings and player settings. This box here is more optimization settings. So salary range, pretty self-explanatory as well, but this is for per player. So if you want to say, I don't want anybody that's under $3,000, you can set it to $3,100 is the minimum in which a player can be even attempted to be included into the player pool. But also maybe you don't want to have an overly expensive player. Maybe we get a week where Christian McCaffrey and Dalvin Cook are like $10K or something like that, and you just don't want to pay up for them. You can go down and cap how much your lineups can include for one player specifically. So 9,000. So with these particular settings, no lineups will have a player that is less than $3,100 and also more expensive than $9,000. Same deal with the fantasy point range. There's no real sense to capping it, but setting a minimum does make sense at times. The one thing to be careful about with setting minimums for the fantasy point range is the defense. So, for example, a lot of times a defense that maybe doesn't project all that well, maybe they have a 3 or 4 point projection. That doesn't necessarily mean that they should be excluded from your player pool, from your builds, because they could be super cheap. They could serve as a punt. So be careful with that. But for example, let's say 4 points is our minimum. We're typically not wanting many receivers or running backs or quarterbacks with a projection of under 4. So it's a good setting there to include, or I should say to exclude, players with bad projections. But keep in mind, sometimes you want to keep it a little bit lower to account for those defenses. Salary cap, this is good for showdowns. The David Jones rule 101, you don't want to max your salary in showdowns to avoid duplicate lineups. So maybe you say, okay, I want 49,000. Maybe that's your salary. Maybe you want to leave 500 on the table, whatever you want to do. But also, maybe there are lineups where you just say, okay, I don't want to leave a lot of money on the table. I want to leave at most $500 on the table. You can set a minimum that your salary cap will be used within those lineups that are being built. Next is the projected ownership cap. Also fairly self-explanatory, but this is for a lineup as a whole. It's not for individual players. It's for a lineup as a whole. And again, another thing to be careful about with this setting is sometimes the ownership changes, right? Sometimes we'll have a running back projected for 50, 60% ownership. Maybe they're very heavy chalk. So maybe the overall landscape of the slate will be a bit more chalky. So be careful with the projected ownership cap. I recommend running a couple lineups just to see where the highest owned lineups come in. And let's say that it's around 250. Maybe you want to be really contrarian and say, okay, I want all my lineups to be under 200% projected ownership. All right, so next is the number of lineups, another self-explanatory setting there. Say we want 10 lineups. You can go all the way up to 300, from 1 to 300, but we're going to leave it at 10 for now. So that's just the number of lineups that you can build. Flex positions, this kind of just basically is your portfolio for what will be in your flex, what positions will be in your flex. Say you don't want any tight ends in your flex, you can mark them down to 0, go 50% wide receiver, 50% running back, call it a day. Or maybe you are playing on FanDuel and you only want running backs. You can go 100% running back, no wide receiver, no flex. Maybe it's a week where you could see yourself maybe playing 10% tight end. You can do that as well. 60% running back, 30% wide receiver. You can do whatever you want, but you can basically allocate exposures by position to that flex spot. Then you can quickly check off disallow more than one pass catcher from the same team unless the quarterback from that team is being in the lineup. So that's just saying if I have a Dallas Cowboys lineup that has, or a lineup with 2 Dallas Cowboy players, say maybe CeeDee Lamb and Amari Cooper, maybe it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to have that lineup without Dak Prescott, so you can disallow that feature. You can also leave it unlocked, whatever you guys want to do. I'll typically find myself disallowing that just because for ceiling purposes, if I'm going to have 2 wide receivers in the same lineup, it probably doesn't make a whole lot of sense to not have the quarterback. But this next one should always be checked no matter what. Force a player from the last game to a flex position. This will allow your lineups to maintain some late game flexibility. Maybe there's an injury, maybe something happens to where you need to be able to swap lineups or swap players within that lineup. So having a player your last available player in the flex position is crucial. So make sure that's always checked on. And it comes default that it's checked on, so you shouldn't have to worry about that. This next one is probably one of my favorite features of the tool, and that's you can force specific amounts of players from specific positions into your lineup at a certain percentage point, right? So let's say, it's one of those weeks where we have a chalky running back, maybe Derrick Henry's 60% owned. And you want to play that Derrick Henry chalk, but you want to ensure that you're going to have some low owned players, maybe some leverage there. So you're going to go, I want at least one player that's a wide receiver in my lineup that's under 10% projected ownership in each lineup. So it'll do this in all of your lineups throughout the build. So it's very nice to have. It's a very utilized feature that I will be making sure I utilize a ton this upcoming season. So next up, prioritize completing lineups above min-max exposure settings. So this one you can unlock if you maybe are okay with, if you request 150 lineups, if you're okay with it coming in a couple lineups short in order to maintain those min-max exposures. But overall, that's not too important. You're kind of good either way. Randomization, that's basically just variance there. So basically, if I assign a 15% randomization setting, it'll apply a 15% boost or decrease to these players' projections in order just to, I guess, introduce and include some diversification within your builds there. So say Derrick Henry is projected for 19 points. In some builds and some lineups, he'll be projecting for a 15% boost or even a 15% decrease, just to ensure that we're getting a bit more variation within those builds. You can show players exposure during the optimization. If you want it to run a little bit faster, you can leave this unclicked. But if you want to see where your players are going, like kind of what kind of exposures you're getting as the lineups are being built, it's good to check that there. So now these next few boxes are kind of what I wanted to save for last here. But at the top, we have optimal mode or tournament mode. So optimal mode is where the generator is going to run strictly based on face value of the projections or the rating or the ceiling, however you decide to run those lineups. So you can essentially run the lineups based on ceiling projection or projection. So whatever you decide to do, the optimal mode is going to run it at face value for those kinds of data, those kinds of numbers, right? So let's say we're running in the optimal mode based on projection. It's going to run 150 lineups, or in this case 10 lineups, based on the projections, and obviously it'll factor in the randomization. But when you switch over to tournament mode, it's actually going to introduce a little bit of a shuffle. I like to call it a shuffle. I think it's easier to explain when you think of it as a shuffle, right? So let's say Derrick Henry is projecting extremely well to a point where if you don't cap his exposure, he's going to end up in all your lineups, right? However, if you do that, he's typically going to, let's say we have him in 80% of the lineups, he's typically going to be found in the first 80% of the lineups and probably not the last. That's just kind of how most generators work, because it's prioritizing that player with that top projection. So this doesn't always happen, but when there's a play that is just an elite projected play, a lot of times that play is going to be funneled into the first 60 or 70% of whatever amount of lineups that they're in. But this shuffle in this tournament mode will actually allow you to add some diversification to your builds by shuffling the player throughout 70%, but from lineup 1 to, let's say, lineup 100, you'll find him there rather than just in the first 70. He'll be in different in 70% of those lineups from 1 to 100. So a lot of times people won't think of it that way, but when you're building lineups, if a player, let's say we have 2 plays that are projecting just to be elite plays, right, where we're going to have a Derrick Henry projected for 32 fantasy points, and then we have an elite value play, maybe, I don't know, something like Chase Edmonds projected for 20 fantasy points. Let's say both of those guys are getting such strong projections that they're, being included in 80% of lineups. They're going to find themselves built into lineups very similarly with people throughout different projections, throughout different lineups, and they're going to be in a lot of lineups with each other, right? So if you include this shuffle, you'll be able to add some diversification to your build. And again, we'll talk about that more in future videos as we continue on through this series, and we're talking more about specific features in this optimizer. But just know that optimal mode versus tournament mode is going to introduce a bit of a shuffle into your builds, and I basically just think of it as diversification within your lineups. Then obviously, like I mentioned earlier, you can decide whether you want to run based on projections or ceiling projections. Then you can run based on whether you want 1 unique player, 2 unique players, 3. You can go all the way up to 6. Depending on the sport, I'll probably live in that 2 to 4 range. And then you can also quickly filter on whether or not you want players allowed versus your defense. Typically, this is going to be at 0 for me, but if it's a smaller slate, maybe it's one of those short slates, the Sunday night and the Monday night slates, it's very possible that you're going to have 2 or 3 players allowed versus your defense. And then browser versus server, you can actually speed up the builder a little bit if you do use server, if you have troubles with it. But I actually haven't had any issues with speed on the browser mode. So then down here, we have the actual player pool. You'll see your players, the exclusions, and then the locked players over here. So all these players are currently excluded. So then see here, we actually excluded McCaffrey and we excluded Dalvin Cook based on the salary cap range. So we can go back up to here, and then they'll be quickly included back into the player pool. So this is what the player pool looks like. Every week we're going to have obviously the players, the matchup stuff, the DVP, the salary, the fantasy point per dollar, which is basically just going to be a number rating that indicates whether or not someone is a good value based on their projection in comparison to their salary. So the higher the number, the better value they are based on their salary. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that we're going to find all the good plays up here, because a lot of times the guys that are projecting extremely well are going to be expensive. That's kind of how it works. So when that's the case, these top end value plays are going to pop as top fantasy point per dollar plays, because they are not only a good projection, but they're a good projection in comparison to their salary. And those top end point per dollar numbers will vary based on the position, because some positions have different kinds of pricing. Like we'll typically not see a ton of quarterbacks in that $9,000 range, while we can see a few running backs up there per week. So keep that in mind. Each week we'll have a ceiling projection as well. Don't have a ceiling projection yet for week 1, but when week 1 does roll around, we will have that. And then we'll have the player rater, which if you guys have been following FTN over the last year and a half or so, I've been doing the player rater for the 4 main sports: MLB, NBA, NFL, and PGA. So that will be in the optimizer for you guys to use there. And then you can actually do some manual edits to projections. So say, you don't agree with the 24 fantasy point projection for McCaffrey, you wanted to give it a little bump. Now, you don't need to do this to ensure, with some other optimizers, you need to actually manually bump up their projections to ensure you get them to a certain point. You don't need to do that with this optimizer, because you can actually apply a minimum exposure. So instead of saying, okay, I know I want more McCaffrey, I'm going to bump him up to 28 points, you can leave him at 24 and say, okay, I want 40% Christian McCaffrey. So instead of having to manually bump up projections, you can actually just apply a minimum exposure there, and McCaffrey will automatically be built into 40% of your lineups. So that's a cool little feature. So typically when you're editing these projections, you're doing it because you're either higher or lower on somebody than the projections are. You don't necessarily need to do it to get more or less of somebody in a lineup, just because of the fact that we have the min and max exposure, which in my opinion is very crucial to DFS. Like if you're building lineups, you're running through them and you're saying, man, I just want more McCaffrey. Maybe I just don't want as much Derrick Henry. Maybe Debro's saying, yeah, I just don't like Derrick Henry this week, and you want to cap that ownership. Or maybe Debro's super high on somebody that maybe isn't projecting all that well on my end. Maybe he's super high on Clyde Edwards-Helaire, and you want to go, okay, Debro's high on Clyde. I want 40% Clyde. You can do that with those min-max exposures. Very awesome part of the tool there. So that was one that was kind of a must for me. And obviously we'll have the DVP stuff that you guys can use for the matchup. Just kind of get an indication of who's having a good matchup and whatnot throughout the season. So that's basically the basics of the tool. There's actually a couple more things down here. So here you can reset the settings. Say you didn't like some of the settings that you made, or maybe you did settings and it didn't quite work for you. You can reset settings. But one very important part is to always click refresh projections instead of actually refreshing your screen, because that way the projections will refresh, not the entire settings, or not the entire screen. So make sure when you're looking to get updated projections, just hit refresh projections and they will update. Now I've noticed that they actually just update automatically when I'm making updates on the back end. But at times, if you guys want to get the updated projections, just hit refresh projections there. All right, I think that's going to do it for this episode of the NFL Optimizer tutorial series. Keep in mind that we will be back for at least six more. I'm sure there will be more, but right now we have 6 additional tutorial videos planned for the NFL Optimizer. And again, we'll have NBA ones when NBA season rolls around. We'll have some MLB ones. We'll also have some PGA ones, so keep that in mind. And again, this optimizer is free right now, so go make sure you're taking advantage of that being free on the site, again, until August 23rd. Appreciate you guys watching. We'll see you next time.